Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Data Integration Demystified, How Education Agencies Can Achieve Interoperability with APIs. I'm your host, Erin Faye Caesar, and today I represent Project Unicorn. This afternoon, we'll discuss how interoperable solutions can dismantle data silos, enable seamless communication and data flow, and empower districts to uncover new collaboration opportunities, all the while maintaining top-tier security. Today's webinar will proceed as follows: an introduction to our speakers in Project Unicorn, a deep dive into APIs, then we'll hear from our panelists. We'll move on to our audience Q&A, and then we will wrap up with our closing. I do want to mention that today's webinar will include a Q&A segment, so please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A chat at any point during the webinar. And you can find the Q&A button between the chat and the participant icon in the toolbar below. Today, we are joined by Rosh from Education Analytics, Molly Stewart from INsite, Indiana University, and Vinaya Maya from EdFi Alliance. This webinar is supported by Project Unicorn and Education Analytics. Project Unicorn is an initiative of Innovate EDU to improve data interoperability in K-12 education. We are a coalition of national education organizations that aim to create a community of innovators who make the broader case for secure interoperability by determining shared priorities, collaborating with school systems and vendors to understand the importance, and creating a demand-side push for data interoperability through partnerships. We are funded by Michael and Susan Dell Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Before we move on to our first speaker, we're going to talk a little bit more about one of the key components of this webinar, which is interoperability. Interoperability is the seamless, secure, and controlled exchange of data between applications. Interoperability can transform teaching and learning by giving teachers the information they need to succeed and enable innovation in classroom practices to help guide students with their own data. Here at Project Unicorn, our work surrounds K-12 interoperability. This includes our webinars, such as this one, publications, and the support we provide through technical assistant calls. This also includes additional resources like our interoperability pledge and our interoperability rubric. Lastly, we released a resource called What is an Application Programming Interface? Last week, this document discusses APIs, defines what they are, and highlights their importance. It also provides best practices and considerations to ensure you're using these practices effectively. And now I will hand it over to our first speaker, Rosh.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning to wherever you're at. My name is Rosh Danaude, and I am the Director of Cloud Engineering and Interoperability at Education Analytics. Education Analytics is a nonprofit based in Madison, Wisconsin, that does work both in large-scale analytics for state agencies and school districts, and then also, as of late, in the last few years, deploying infrastructure and technology to enable the collection of data to do those large-scale analytics. And my portion of the slides for this portion of the webinar will be going over what is an API. We are going to try and keep this at a pretty elementary level and not get too much into jargon, but sometimes I get carried away. And so if you have any questions or if you have any follow-ups, I'm happy to engage in the chat once my portion is done to make sure I clarify any terms that I use that are still murky after we go through the slides. So first thing to do is, what is an API? What does the actual acronym stand for? Well, it stands for Application Programming Interface. I don't think we use the full terminology in day-to-day work. We generally just use the phrase API. When you think about what an API is, we're going to try and give you some vocabulary to answer the question of what is an API. And then on the next slide, we're going to go through what I like to use analogies. And so trying to ground the concept of what an API provides in a real life example that's not an API, right? But API adjacent. So what does an API allow you to do? Well, it first enables software to communicate with each other. It allows for machines to communicate with other machines through a set of standardized communication. Now, if you think about your interactions with the internet, whether you're an online shopper or you're retrieving your health records from your healthcare provider, behind the scenes, when you click on something in your browser, that browser then interacts with an API to draw information back to your screen and then service whatever you've asked the browser to do. So when you're adding something to your cart or you're checking out or you're submitting your credit card information, these are all machines talking to each other, but it is you as a human that are directing an action that you want to be completed. And then you let the machines do the talking to figure out what they need to figure out in order to do the thing that you ask them to do. So at the very core, an API is a communication interface between machines, sometimes multiple machines, sometimes just one machine. But in general, when you think about what an API is, think about the fact that it is a communication layer between multiple machines. The next thing is it also puts in place a set of rules and protocols in order to govern that communication. When you go to add something to your cart, you want to make sure that the exact item that you want to be added to the cart is what's added to the cart. So the API has specific commands, it has specific endpoints, it has specific instructions that are followed when you click on a button in order to do the action that you have asked it to do. And so these rules enable developers to be able to create interfaces for humans or interfaces for machines that constrain the types of actions that can be taken. This can be done for user experience. This can also be done for the sake of security. And oftentimes it's for both. You want to make sure that you have a safe and secure experience when data is being transmitted from one person to another or from one machine to another. When we think about the education realm, we're all dealing with data that is protected by FERPA, and we want to make sure that the actions taken with that data are governed by a set of rules and protocols that will give us assurances about how that data is used, where it goes, how it is then stored, and then how it can be retrieved securely. And so these rules allow for the exchange of information to be governed, and then also gives assurances to whoever is using the system that an API is powering to have assurances for what their actions are leading to. The next thing, it also defines data types and methods for how that happens. So when you are, again, let's go back to the shopping example, you're clicking to add something to your cart, you don't want to go to check out right away. You want just to add something to the cart so that you can review the totals, you can look at your sales tax, or if you're in a sales tax free state, you just look at the total. And then you say, I want to then advance to the next step. So not only are there rules governing the flow of checkout, but there are also specific methods that are used throughout those steps and specific data types that are then shown to you. You sometimes will see the total and your subtotal before you get to getting a grand total. And those are data types that furnish to you a specific type of total, a specific type of values on the screen. The API is able to then interact with the machine that is the source of that information and pull that back in. So when you're in Indiana, the API goes to a specific data source where there's a data type that says sales tax and then brings back the percentage of sales tax that needs to be applied to your cart. If you're in Delaware and there's no sales tax, well, it comes back and says no sales tax. So those data types are important to not only help you as the user interact with the system, but also to make sure the correct data is coming back and the correct types of data are being displayed during the interaction that those machines are enabling for the human. So let's look at an analogy for what is an API. And I use different analogies at times. And I think the one that I have settled on that is universally applicable and hopefully most people know is the example of an ATM. And so if you are in the habit of using cash, which is maybe fewer and fewer of us nowadays, but in general, I don't usually go into my bank physically and then go to a teller and talk to a person and then retrieve money. Now, if we're using the definitions that we use on the previous slide, that is a human API interface. So I go into the bank, I go talk to a person, that person adheres to a set of rules, and there's a method for transferring information, or in that case, cash, over to me because I've turned in a piece of paper that says how much cash I want. Well, in general, the way that most people retrieve cash that don't want to deal with people or because of convenience and maybe inaccessibility to a bank of their choice will need to use an ATM or a machine to be able to retrieve cash. Well, what are the components of it? Well, a person wants to interact with a bank. They want to be able to transact and they want to be able to retrieve something that belongs to them or something that they would like to use. The next, the ATM, when you walk up to an ATM, regardless of whether you're in the United States or in another country, or you're going from one state to the other or one bank to another, in general, you walk up to an interface that has a screen, that has a set of buttons, and it has a slot to insert your card, and it has a slot that gives you money back. And so those methods govern the interaction that you have with that machine. It is constrained to only particular types of interactions in order to get you from point A, where you have no money, to point B, where you're able to retrieve the money from your account. Next, there are standards that govern the transfer of money. So behind the scenes, when you insert your debit card and you put in your PIN and then you ask the bank to validate that PIN, there are transfers of information between that terminal that you're at to the bank. And then there is a interaction between that bank and that machine to say, yes, this is the right person. They have furnished the right credentials and they have rights to be able to retrieve the money that they are asking for. And then the money that comes back to you, let's say you normally live in the United States and you're in the United Kingdom and you're retrieving money. Well, now you are going to want to retrieve the money in the local currency, which is pound sterling. And when the bank says this person can withdraw 20 pounds sterling, there is an interaction between the bank and the machine to then determine how much US dollars gets transferred into pound sterling and then eventually comes out in the ATM that you're interacting with. And then finally, it presents a universal form factor to standardize engagement. So for me as a traveler, if I go to another country and I need to retrieve cash, I may not know the local language. I may not know the local customs of how to interact with a local banking agency, but I do know how to interact with an ATM. It allows for me to go from context to context, but preserve the same experience to achieve the same outcomes. Now, when we look in the education realm, there are multiple standards agencies and then also multiple APIs that those standards agencies manage and endorse. And there are a couple of examples here on the screen. Certainly, this is not a comprehensive list of APIs that are available for education, but they represent some market leaders and then also some market use cases that necessitate the existence of an API and then also allow for educators, school districts, and others to be able to then use these APIs to transact data between the systems that they own. So one of the first ones that you may be familiar with is the Google Classroom API. In order to roster the Google Classroom interface with rosters, with classes, with seating invitations, and bringing people in that are users of Google Classroom, not just those that are in classes, the Google Classroom API enables a user to connect their system with a data source and then also retrieve data through particular methods to put them into these three classes of engagement within the system. The other one that is a market leader in rostering is the OneRoster API, and then also the EDU API from our friends at OneEdTech. It enables the standard exchange of rosters, grades, and enrollment between various education systems. It allows somebody within a school district to have a student information system in which they manage rosters and they manage enrollment. And then when they have another system that they need to send those rosters to, they can avail of the OneRoster API to push that data there. And in some cases allows for grades to be adjudicated in another system and then passed back to the system of record that has the rosters and enrollment. Another broader data standard is A4L CIF framework, which also has an API, which allows for the exchange of real-time data between education systems. And as we transition into the next slides, and I pass it over to my webinar partners, they're going to highlight the importance of being able to transact data near to when that data was created in order to foster positive outcomes for students, and the SIF framework allows for that. And then finally, the Ed5 framework, and then also the API is something that we use at Education Analytics and have based our product stack off of. It also, like SIF, enables the real-time exchange of data between multiple data systems and allows us to be able to transact that data securely, just like all these other APIs on the screen. I hope that that was helpful, and I'll transition over to my partners for the next portion of the slides.
Thank you for that, Rosh. Now we'll hear from Molly and Vinaya.
Good morning, everyone. I am Vinaya. I am Senior Technical Program Manager at Ed5 Alliance. For Ed5 Alliance, our goal is data interoperability to achieve student success. For the Alliance, I work with the team that develops the Ed5 Alliance API, which conforms to Ed5 Alliance data standard. So what we see when we are working with the school districts, right? What we see is that there is no restriction on the data. There is a lot of data that is available, but it is hard to use. Most of the challenges that we see when you're working with the school districts is that the data is outdated, it comes in slowly, and then there is a lot of complexity involved with the data gathering, and then there is also siloed systems that make it a big challenge to get a complete picture of the student, to help the student achieve their educational goals and outcomes. What we see is in the school districts, we see that to support that, at the center, you see a classroom there. To support that classroom, school districts build a lot of systems, point-to-point or system-to-system integrations, a lot of customizations, and then it results into a messy server room with a growing complexity in the architecture. And then the school districts end up having to have a set of or a team of architects, data analysts who extract, transform, script, and schedule, basically manually moving the data across different systems to provide that complete picture. And it takes a lot of their effort instead of focusing on making sure what can improve, right? The end applications that could improve student success. Instead of that, the focus is on just getting the data out. So Ed5 Alliance has a data standard, as Rosh mentioned earlier, right? That helps basically to remove this complexity and make it a lot more easier to move the data. So in here, I have depicted like the SIS data systems and the assessment data systems and finance data systems, LMS, all that. I mean, this is a simplified view. In reality, there will be more than one API or more than one standard working together. But the goal is that the data comes from SIS system into the API, and the assessment data can read that roster data of student registration. And the student success data is available as well to the SIS system or HR system that talks to the SIS system. The staff data that is there in the SIS system combines with the data that is there in the HR system to give a one holistic view. And everything is basically in support of end user, which is our teachers, to help support the personalized personalized study goals for the students, and for our school districts leaders to understand how their students, their schools, and their teachers are doing, and use that data to basically to make, in the decision making, in the resource allocation and policy making, as well as for the states to generate the reporting that they need to generate in order to provide the funding that districts need on time. This is a simplified view, but at the same time, the complexity that was there before, much of it is gone, and the data moves between the systems securely, safely, and in real time. Yeah, so basically, Rosh gave a nice analogy on the what an API is using ATM. That was awesome, Rosh. And this basically says how that API can simplify things in the education domain. With that, what you get, right? So basically a complete view of the student, that school and district and state, basically coming from different source systems, combining and give a combined view. And then a safe and seamless, secure data transmission between different systems, and basically empowering the districts to have the ownership of their data, and the data is not siloed in different applications and tools. APIs also will allow, basically, once the infrastructure is built, you can easily build additional tooling on top of it to support your students. Thank you. I will transfer it over to Molly.
Great, thank you, Vinaya. So I'm Molly Stewart, Director of the INsite Consortium, and we have worked with about 30 districts on various interoperability projects. So I'm just going to give a few examples of what our districts have actually used APIs to accomplish. One of the probably most basic but powerful or impactful uses of the API is just reducing the labor of combining multiple data sets. We see a lot of district staff spending quite a bit of time combining data sets using Excel or tools within their SISs. And we have been able to support them in writing one script for the standardized data that can be reused multiple times throughout whenever they want to get those updates. Similar to this second point, you can schedule those, you can reuse the effort and the time that you've put in to take advantage of the standardized API data, standardized data coming through the API instead of redoing the work every time it needs to be done. So this also enables districts to perhaps look at those combined data sets more often than they would otherwise, because previously it took a lot more work. So we've had districts, for example, looking at attendance updates with other data points at the end of every school day, trying to do interventions, before the student gets too much further along in their attendance issues. We have a district using weekly updates that look at in-progress grades, attendance, behavior, and some other demographic information and teacher information to really intervene with those students as quickly as possible instead of waiting until it's too late. And we've learned through this process that while the SIS is very powerful in terms of collecting that data and keeping much of the data in one place, it's not the right tool for seeing the data and really using the data in a bigger picture. So the API has really allowed us to make better use even of data that's just in one system. And then finally, the third point and some subpoints here is just the real-time nature of this. So we can include data sources such as assessment vendors. We have, I believe, 3 assessment vendors that we work with right now that have written their own API, and we're so grateful for that. I will just give them a shout out: Mastery Connect. Oh gosh, I should have written these down before I got on the air. Rosh, remind me. Curriculum Associates, and we've also got a vendor down in New Mexico that has just recently
iStation.
certified. iStation, yes, thank you so much. So we've got and AimsWeb, of course. AimsWeb was one of our first. So we've got those data sources just coming directly into the standardized database as soon as the student finishes the test. And that's just an incredible benefit to districts that are trying to make decisions as soon as they can with the data that's available as soon as it is created. And then the second point there, we can more easily query this than most source systems. APIs using the standards allow us to either use operational data store or a data warehouse, and you can reuse that work, as I said before, over and over again, instead of doing work multiple times and really wasting a lot of manpower. And I know I've heard some concerns about this kind of thing taking away from certain positions in school districts, but the folks that we work with have honestly been able to do way more with their data because they're not spending so much time just compiling it. So we've really, I wouldn't say it's taken anyone's job away, but rather enabled people to do more interesting things with the data that they have available to them. And then finally, a very popular use case for this is to connect to visualization software. So you have your data in the database, and if you want to make it more available to folks who aren't super data savvy or don't know how to use a database queries, we can use Power BI or Tableau or Google Data Studio to make that data more visible to your users in the district. And the API also enables you to have row-level security where only certain users can see certain things, as opposed to using a spreadsheet or emailing data, which unfortunately still happens quite a bit. So these are some examples of what we've seen districts use the API for in our consortium. And I will go ahead and turn it back over to, I believe, Erin Fay for some Q&A, I believe.
Thank you so much for that, Molly and Vinaya. We are going to get into the prepared questions for our speakers for this webinar. And our first question is, what are the best practices for ensuring security and compliance in APIs? And Vinaya, would you like to start by answering this question?
Sure, Irene. Yeah, I as in at Fire Alliance, right? I do work with the team that is building the Alliance API. So I will answer that question with the perspective of what things that we focus when we are building our API, right? One main thing is, I would say, authentication and authorization. Authentication is basically identifying who is logging in and who is using the API. And authorization is having the proper control measures on the API user to make sure the right data gets into the hands of the API user and not the data that they shouldn't have access to. Another thing I would say is data encryption. Is the main feature of the API is for moving the data from one system to the other, and that data usually moves across web. And having a proper encryption allows that secure communication. And in terms of API, it's usually HTTPS connection between the two systems, the client and the server. Another major thing we focus on is input validation, making sure that the data that gets into the API is secure, and it does not have anything that could cause security issues further downstream, which is either, I'm throwing some technical terms here. If there are questions, please do ask. So there is a possibility of scripts getting into the API, either JavaScripts, the user level, browser level scripts, or the SQL scripts getting in. So having the API sanitize that data before it lands it into the destination. Having proper audit logging, making sure that there is a comprehensive logging that is available, so that if there is an issue, there is a way to go back and do an audit. Another major thing I think that's important is having a regular security assessment, yearly assessment or release assessment of changes that are coming into the API, making sure that the API still adheres to the industry standards of security. And having a security mindset, right? The security cannot be added as an add-on. It should be built in. So secure design is the core of it, right? Start with the security in the mindset. So this is what, things that we at FI Alliance focus on. And I think these a set of things are a good list for anybody who is looking for an API to take a look at and see how things are built on the API side, and then make the pick. I did include, I think I could mention one more thing is the documentation, right? So documentation does help in identifying what gets collected and what kind of access control is on there. So that is also part of, I guess, ensuring security in the APIs.
And if I could add just one more thing too on the user side, since we work also on the implementation side of districts and state agencies using EdFi. One of the things is that everything that Vinaya mentioned is excellent and is proper design, but it's only as strong as the practices on the usage of the API. So proper distribution, storage, and usage of the client keys and secret that are being used to interact with the API. So EdFi uses an OAuth2 two-legged authentication model. Just sorry to be a little jargony, but I think it's worth talking through. And so you have a key and a secret that then allows you to be able to access the data in your data scope through the API. If you reveal that key and secret to somebody, they have access then to all of your data. So making sure that you're not only doing best practices with the technology that you're choosing, but also the practices that you have on your side during implementation go a long way towards making sure that the intended use of the API is being fulfilled and not being circumvented because your key and secret have been leaked out, or you've posted it publicly, or you've allowed people to see it. I think that goes also for those that are doing direct implementation with the EdFi API and creating native integrations, integrating best practice there, like obscuring the password, the secret, or making sure that the secret is only entered one time and then not seen by a user. There are just small little design decisions that can be made that make sure that all the security that's being baked into the technology is conveying out into the field and shouldn't be overlooked as well.
Thank you for that, Vinaya and Rosh. The next question that we have is, what considerations should districts keep in mind when selecting and integrating APIs into their existing systems? Vinaya, would you like to also answer this question?
Sure, Irene. Yeah, I think districts should start with their use case and their goal, and decide on what aligns with the specific business needs for that district. So that's the starting point, I would say. And then based on that use case, then decide on which set of standards that apply to that use case. And then from there, from that set of standards, figure out which APIs support that standard or APIs that are built on that standard. And also look at the things that we mentioned just earlier, right? How that API is built. So once the infrastructure or the standard and the API is decided, then also look for vendors who support that API integration or that standard, who can vendor applications that can talk that language, and also investigate on the set of the cost and the return of investment, and what exactly they are looking for, right, in terms of productivity and the student outcome. And then also partner with other folks who have used that standard and who have used that API. So which actually simplifies a lot of things when you're starting up with the new API for your integration, right? So like EdFi has a big community, and people have already done what most of the time what you are trying to accomplish. So using that knowledge and also working with partners. So there are partners who have set this up before. So tapping into that knowledge will definitely help in figuring out your API integration. Thank you.
Yeah, one thing that we've come to value at Education Analytics, I'll just shorten it to EA. So one thing that we've come to value at EA is the community that's built up around a lot of the commercial APIs that are available and open source APIs that are available in the education space, which enable not only like how do you deploy this, but then also how do you continue to evolve the data standard, or how do you continue to evolve the tools? So there are several communities that are robust. So the One EdTech community is pretty wide and has a lot of robust conversations around the development of their APIs. So does the EdFi Alliance. And I think when you are looking to decide which standard to adopt or which API to adopt within your particular setting, looking to see, is there a community? Is there a wider range of people that I can interact with? Am I going to be on an island implementing this, or do I have people to reach out to be able to help us get down the road to the point of where we're using this productively and not just sitting on it or spending a long time in implementation and losing steam?
And I'll just jump in there because I think this is a good segue from what Rosh just said to one of the questions in the chat about how do you actually get started with this. I would say from my experience working with quite a few districts on the process, thinking about what your use cases are first. How do you want to use that data once it is interoperable? Are you wanting to use a visualization? Are you wanting to primarily use a data warehouse? Do you have someone in your district that can do that querying and reporting for you, or do you need an external partner to handle that for you? So in terms of the size of your district, the scope of expertise there, and also what your budget is, those are going to be things that you want to keep in mind. The EdFi Alliance really encourages folks to work with a managed service provider because it can be difficult for a district by themselves to implement an API and a data standard and the tooling that goes along with it. One of the things that we recently one of the challenges that we recently came across in the INsite Consortium is needing to update our data standard and API system. And it was a very big lift for a small group of districts. So working with an experienced technical partner that has multiple implementations going on at once, and they can see what's coming down the line, how can we prepare for this, involved in whatever working groups or, professional communities where they need to keep abreast of changes that are going to be happening, and also kind of using that private company or group developmental mindset, like R&D mindset, which a school district often cannot use, finances for that kind of thing. So looking at different managed service providers, I believe that the EdFi website has a list of those providers that are badged for EdFi. I'm not sure how that would work with other data standards and API groups like Roche listed, but I'm just kind of starting to think about the use case, I think, is the best way to go about it, and then trying to figure out the best partners for you to meet that use case most successfully and within your budget.
And to what Molly just mentioned, I think shout out to our friends at Project Unicorn, and then also ISTE. Both of these groups maintain lists of organizations that have submitted their products to be vetted and that align to certain interoperability standards and expectations. And so those are some good resources to get started as well. If you're looking broader than EdFi, both ISTE and Project Unicorn maintain lists of badged vendors that could be a helpful starting point as well.
Thank you. Our next question is, how can schools and districts ensure data privacy and security when integrating different systems using APIs, especially considering the sensitive nature of student information? Molly, would you like to answer this one?
Definitely. So we've seen a lot of evolution in school and district staff understanding of kind of the ways in which FERPA requirements can be impacted by standardized and non-standardized data situations. So when you don't have a way to send data via a secure system such as an API, you get a lot of sharing of files. Files shared in email is not secure, but a lot of times it's the only way that someone can really do it without going through 5 or 6 steps that, let's be honest, school and district staff don't have the extra time, honestly, to make those extra steps. So an API really reduces the amount of work that a school and district staff member need to do to keep their data secure. That, I think, is one of the biggest advantages to this, to these kinds of implementations. Being able to allow the tech department of the district to say which staff members should have access to which things, and we limit that kind of in the base claim set, and then downstream those things should continue to hold true. So for example, we have a dashboard that we offer our districts. It's a web-based dashboard, and it's built on the claim sets in the API or ODI. We still use an operational data store. I know EdFi is going away from that, but so each of our users has a claim set built in that comes from their SIS claim set. So it's automatic. It matches what they already have access to, which means when they log into our product, they aren't seeing more than they should, but they're seeing what they need to. And that has been a very efficient and streamlined way to allow folks to see what they need and not to see too much.
Yeah, I'd like to underscore what Molly said too, is the subtext to that is even taking out the step of well, somebody has this level of access in one system, and then having to have the cognitive load and also maintenance overhead of saying, oh, this person has a different set of rules in this other system, introduces like little cracks in the armor for student data to leak out. And so what adhering to a data standard or using an API allows you to do is like move those decisions to a central point where you can say, okay, everything downstream of here is scoped in this particular way. It then allows those staff members to not have to like think so hard about who can see what things in which different system, because you are centralizing a lot of those decisions. So time saved is not just like collating data. It's also these little small time savings along the way that allow people to then focus on like, institutional security practices or doing phishing training and like allowing for the time to do these other bits of security training and security layering on because you're taking certain manual tasks off their plate is also part of this equation as well. So when you're thinking about adopting an API, don't think about it just as we're deploying a technology, but you're also reclaiming time that people use, and then you can redeploy that time to enable skills development or increasing their security posture as well. So I don't want that to get missed, because Molly like highlighted something super important that we've seen on the ground. And I think it's important that you all as consumers of this information think about broadly as well, especially when you start to think about rationalizing this to decision makers, like having a lot of reasons to show them beyond just technology implementation starts to make implementations of these technologies sticky and hardened, so that you can continue to keep them around for a long period of time and continue to see like a long tail of return on investment. And so that all contributes to privacy and security, because the more capacity you have to focus on those things, the less chances there are for one of those cracks to widen.
Yeah, I also want to add one more thing, right? So APIs, when it is a standardized API, you also have most of the data that is collected is documented, right? So it makes it a lot more simpler to understand how data moves from one place to other. So there is, how the data is collected, how the access is controlled is visible, and it's known by a larger set of implementations who are implementing it. So there is a shared knowledge there as well to secure that API. So there is common patterns, common points of intersections where you can easily focus your security on those places to make sure that the data transfer is secure, rather than imagine an ad hoc integration, right? So where you are thinking, as Rosh said, you are thinking a lot on how to secure each pieces of it, as well as a lot of people interaction as well. Like when you have files moving here and there is a lot of people interaction as well, which is all limited when there is an API. So it actually makes it a lot more easier, I would say, to secure an API compared to without an API.
Thank you for that, Vinaya, Rosh, and Molly. Again, we want the audience to put some of their questions in the chat, and we'll start answering those for you.
Erin Faye, I was going to type in an answer, but since we're on to this part, I can just
definitely
answer
go for it
verbally, if that's okay. So
Yeah.
The question in the chat was how many SIS vendors currently support APIs, and are there examples? So I am most familiar with the EDFI data standard, so I'm going to speak to that, but there may be other SISs that work with other data standards. So if you go to the EDFI Alliance website, for example, you can see a list. Oh, yes, Vinaya, thank you so much. There is a list of EDFI certified products, including SIS vendors, assessment vendors, and I think maybe a couple of other types of vendors. So you can go there and see if your SIS is listed. This would be, we're working on getting that linked to you all.
I will.
I would just note that even if a vendor is certified, depending on what state you're in, depending on whether that state has a state reporting implementation using a particular API or data standard, that may affect the affordability of your SIS supporting that. So I don't really want to throw this up as a barrier, but it's definitely something to be aware of. If an SIS is required to do state reporting with, let's say, the EdFi data standard, they can't charge you to use it yourself. But if your state isn't using it, you might have to pay another fee to the SIS provider for supporting that because they're not doing it otherwise. So those are some things to ask in that. If you don't see your SIS provider on that list that that Vinaya shared, it's still worth it to maybe reach out to someone at the EdFi Alliance to say, you know, have you had discussions with this provider? You know, are they going in this direction? Kind of things like that, because it's a process and it can take a while for an SIS provider to get everything in place to really go through certification. So even if you don't see them on that list, it doesn't mean that they're not necessarily working on it at all. The other thing that I think is pretty cool for districts is that if you move from one, let's say, EdFi certified SIS vendor to another EdFi certified SIS vendor, all of your downstream data warehouse, analytics, those are going to stay the same. You don't have to reinvent those wheels because when the data comes through the API, it looks the same, even though it's going to look different in the SIS. So that really alleviates a lot of other effort added to the change in an SIS, which is huge. So we really like to emphasize that as well.
If I could add to, so in the state of Indiana, I was part of the INsite crew up until a couple of years ago, and when we first started that project, we had a SIS vendor that was only an Indiana SIS vendor, and they were able to go from not having an EdFi implementation to now having gone through 2 iterations of their EdFi API support. So it definitely is possible, and the community around EdFi involves vendors as well. And so when you are evaluating adopting a standard or adopting an API in particular, that community is important because it will give you a sense of, is there a pathway for a vendor that currently doesn't do it to be able to support it in the future? If there is a community that includes peers, maybe they won't be sharing highly sensitive information about their internal practices, but they may share best practices around adopting EdFi or OneRoster or whatever it is. That's also helpful. And we've seen multiple examples throughout the country of a vendor going from no implementation to having a fully fledged first-class implementation within, in some cases lately, even like within a few months. So vendors can do it. It's just a matter of asserting some market pressure, and folks like Project Unicorn and others in the space are putting that pressure on by enforcing pledges and getting people to understand the value of engaging in interoperability.
Yeah, and just a shout out to COSIN, who's been working on a framework for kind of that. They have a framework for many things in the interoperability space, but the thing that they've built out the most so far is about the market piece of it and the writing into your RFP what you need. So I don't have a link to that offhand, but if you probably just Google the COSIN interoperability framework, you'll find it. And perfect. Thank you, Paula. I forgot you're on the call. Awesome.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Molly. We're going to finish the webinar here. I just want to say a big thank you to our speakers for joining us today and being on this panel. Thank you for your expertise. Thank you for your knowledge and your wisdom. It's been everything for this webinar. You can reach out to Project Unicorn for any additional questions or to get in touch with our speakers here. You can also stay in touch with us to learn more about our latest events, such as this webinar and some of our resources. Again, we have a resource database on our website, along with a Project Unicorn YouTube channel with all of our previous webinars too, if you want to get caught up on those as well. Thank you for joining us today. We hope this webinar has been informative and addressed any questions you may have regarding APIs and interoperability in K-12 education. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day.